Right. Whakalofa howhiwhi atu kia matulu osi, whakaue lahi to the organisers and to the other speakers this afternoon. I'm zooming in from Otipoti and I make acknowledgements to Kaitahu, Kati Māmoe and Waitaha as mana whenua here. It's a privilege to be here, and a little bit I feel like the humanities scholar that snuck round the back into the webinar, because I'm not from a health background, and I currently don't sit in a health background either. So it's nice. It's nice to add that kind of elemental balance to the conversation. I'll also try not to get off track too much, but not too many promises there. So I'm the daughter of Ben Pasisi. That's a picture of my mum and dad. On the right, they're probably pretty happy because it's a picture when I gave them my first paycheck from when I started my postdoc job. My dad is the son of Lealasia Limata and Matangi Pasisi from Mutalo. There's my family house in the top right. And our family's from kind of Mutalo and Hikutavaki, village-wise. And I would disagree with Colin. I think Mutalo was the best at Holonga, even though I wasn't there. So I'm attempting to squish my roughly 300-page PhD thesis into a highlights reel, with some extra bits about my postdoc and current research, which are also focused on Niue. With the knowledge that at least for the thesis, it's publicly accessible. So if anyone's looking for some late night reading, you're more than welcome to search that online. I will say that my dad has actually read my thesis. He fell asleep a couple of times, but he assured me that it was a forecast thing, not a reflection on the work. So this thesis happened across 2015 and 2019, kind of the years in between there. And it was around 6 trips to Niue for me and 2 stints working as an intern at Taonga Niue. I'm forever grateful to Moira Inetama and the team for letting a very green researcher work alongside them. I received a doctoral research scholarship from Waikato, and I also took some money from MFAT. I got a fieldwork scholarship for funding as well. The thesis centered on the questions of how Niue women conceptualize and perceive climate change in Niue, how we pay attention to women's narratives in ways that are culturally specific and appropriate. There was a lot of research at the time that indicated that the burden of negative impacts relating to climate change would overwhelmingly be on Indigenous people and women and children in particular. This next image, comes from the University of Waikato Library display during Niue Language Week, I think in 2018. Now, even though I had given them a list, right, of all the Niue written texts that they had in their collection, the way they decided to kind of do their display was with all of these books, right? Only one of which is about Niue, and it's the Margaret Pointer book, unfortunately. And the rest are about kind of climate change, right? So in my thesis, this is what's happening around at the time, where there's knowledge of, or there's examples of Niue written work, as kind of Minister Talangi has already talked about. It's sitting there, right? It's just not being engaged with. And part of the reason that it's not being engaged with is because non-Niue people, for whatever reason, can't see it, right? They very rarely engage with it. And so that's what my thesis kind of sought to overcome, right? So I'm sitting, as I'm doing my thesis work, at the intersections of management studies, so in business, but also Pacific studies. Now, it ends up leaning more heavily in Pacific studies because of the critical work that is possible from that discipline. In part because Pacific studies pushes us to consider kind of Indigenous perspectives Indigenous uses of knowledge, and being in conversation with these kind of wider Indigenous networks, right? Niue-centered research is obviously important for Niue people, but it can also sit within and connect with other Indigenous research. And in these connections, it's possible to leverage greater resources and capacity to instigate change and innovation that challenges, I've written dumb governments and racist institutions, but I think I've forgotten to like turn the academic lenses on that. I'm interested, right? So I'm deeply interested in the specificities of Niue women's stories. And I desperately want to not have to cite only Loeb, Smith, or Pointer. So in order to do that, I developed the Hiapo methodology. And within this methodology, it becomes a Niue-specific approach to research that centers research being Niue-led, but also broadens the scope of academic sources of Niue knowledge, drawing intentionally from multiple sources, in my case, our written, visual, and oral repositories. To empower Niue women's stories, I foregrounded the wider Niue canon of literature that includes academic work published by people like Terry Chapman, Billy Nosa, collaborative articles by Moni Songhai and Colin, obviously, master's dissertations by Leo Vayer, Darcel Apelu, and many others. So even though it's not necessarily centered on climate change or women, recognizing the broader landscape of Niue academic work sets a platform for engaging with Niue perspectives more directly. I also went deeper into periodicals like Tohitala, or the Niue's newsletter, which honestly I think is one of our most overlooked knowledge sources. So before we have texts like Niue, A History of the Island by Chapman, Etuata, Hiko, and all of the crew, we have these kind of stories that pop up, right? Letters to editor or particular kind of columns that center on Niue origin stories, for example. So we have the likes of Ulu Angamotsu from Motolo, Solomona from Alofi, Taue he Tangaloa of Avasele, Papitalangi, and Patutoe of La Kipa, writing up a storm about Niue origins, some of which connect with stories written in the Talaho Niue, which is the London Missionary Society periodical that had Niue missionaries writing these kind of talatuai or stories of old. And some of those stories are the ones that actually end up being translated into Loeb's work. And some of them he cites well or references well. Others of them he doesn't cite very, very well at all or translate very well. So all of this is in the kind of background, right? And then when I'm talking about visual repositories, one of the forms that I focused on in my thesis was using photographs, right? The way that we've documented Niue life, Niue experience, in particular photographs. And for me in particular, I had ones from my grandmother, who I never met, but there's pictures of her and my dad's oldest brother, Uto, getting ready to come across to New Zealand for education with one of the ships in the background. Importantly, the stories that kind of are evoked from images as well as recorded in them provide these platforms with platforms to engage with Niue experience. And so to foreground Niue women's voices, it was critical to center all of what is possible to find in relation to Niue culture, identity, and worldview. Paying attention to ancestral stories of women like Fisingaulu or Matangini Fale, Hina or Hake Hetoa, or writing by the likes of Malama Head, Samoa Tongakilo, and others, all strengthened the arguments that I could then make about being exclusive to Niue women as knowledge holders in their own right. In the thesis, I had 12 women who contributed to the research, and each story is given its own place within the text. What started out as questions about climate change always spread off and went off into conversations about ways of living, being in the environment, learning from parents and grandparents, experiences of movement and leadership, and other roles within their community, and so much more. The women featured in the thesis did not all agree on what climate change is, or even whether it existed or not. But importantly, that wasn't the kind of useful thing in having the conversations themselves. And actually, it's a reminder that phrases like climate change can be discarded or can be or might not be useful in our understandings of the knowledge that we hold more deeply. So it's important not to confuse the imposition of a foreign term or framing within the vastness of Niue worlds and worldviews. And I think that more generally of research as well. It's incredible and useful to draw on foreign and other kind of knowledge systems, but it's not the only way that we can understand our knowledge. Interestingly, although people knew I was doing a project about Niue women, I was still told or taken or introduced to many Niue men to talk with. And I ended up including parts of these conversations in a kind of community repository of knowledge, in part to recognize that within Niue discussions of gender, that focusing on one does not necessarily necessitate making others invisible. So going deeper into gender roles in Niue, it becomes clear very quickly that while there are gendered domains, there's also a blurriness or fluidity in how people move, adapt, and are self-determining across all aspects of their lives. Perhaps most strikingly was how Niue knowledge came to be at the center of these women's stories about climate change, and yet was often seen as something that was taken for granted. People would lament how elder generations were moving on and so many stories were being lost. So in doing this research, I learned that Niue was massive, way too big for a single thesis, but also the work of Niue people was so poorly recognized in the academy. So it sparked what continues to be a career where I get to do research that is mostly entirely focused on Niue. And that's perhaps a segue into my postdoc, which was funded by the Health Research Council of New Zealand. And it looked at Niue people's conceptualizations of happiness. Again, I used the Hiapo methodology to guide the research and seek multiple Niue reference points to answer questions about how we understand what happiness is, what it looks like in our everyday lives, and what we value or what value we place on happiness. In collating information about happiness for tangata Niue, the research project set new precedents in where Indigenous peoples start conversations about their health and well-being. Questions such as what makes you happy or what does happiness mean to you are seldom part of the experiences tangata Niue have with health research. And yet, many elders of this project clearly identified happiness, specifically the happiness of their children, to be a key driver in their own lives. In fact, most Niue people interviewed placed a high value on happiness in their lives, but what that looks like and how it is prioritized varied. So very briefly, some common themes from where Niue people find happiness included, of course, Niue Kai, spirituality, religious spaces, family relationships and identity, particularly being with each other, having family or community connections, places to showcase Niue pride or identity, happiness in acts of service, helpfulness, usefulness, happiness in Niue learning and knowledge, and shared memories and storytelling, specifically intergenerationally, happiness in laughter, cheekiness, and pranks, happiness in wakaho, happiness in being home, specifically being in Niue on the island, happiness in the wisdom of elders, and also happiness in Niue time. Niue time is something I like to put forward as similar to island time, right? Not in that it takes on these kinds of ideas of lateness, but actually of the importance of presence, the importance of spending time with people, not necessarily being kind of confined by Western time. So in this project, I got to take 5 multi-generational groups of tautangata Niue home to Niue. For some, it was their first time. I also collaborated with Niue educators, artists, and researchers to create experiences and opportunities to engage with Niue knowledge. The flow-on impacts of this style of research are difficult to quantify, but are so significant in the trajectory of positive-oriented Niue-driven research. And more importantly for me, it's also really important for forging relationships between Niue diaspora and those on island. The Happiness Project also enabled or spurred the establishment of Matale Taume, a collective of Niue artists, scholars, and people with just way too many hats to name, that ran the first Niue Knowledge Symposium in Tamaki in 2022. And more recently, a Niue Knowledge Conference in Niue last year. Matala Taume was simply created to celebrate Niue knowledge. It's about enabling intergenerational knowledge sharing and creating spaces for Niue to Niue connections, whether it's through language, practice, or other forms. Our ability to come together and learn from each other has immense valuable. And being mindful of time. Here's some cool photos from my master's project, which I'll talk about another time. So all of my research has centered on relationships with people and finding ways to work collaboratively with people both in and outside of the academy, because so much of the knowledge that I experience should never be held by only 1 or 2 people. And I see the value in more Niue hands holding the taonga that generations before us have provided. And it should not be inaccessible to any Niue person, whether they are a researcher or not. I'm incredibly grateful to the people that I get to work alongside and the grace they have for me as someone who is also still learning. Yes, we definitely need more Niue researchers doing Niue research, but we also need to interrogate the colonial and imperial systems and structures that simultaneously exploit and create barriers for Niue research and researchers. If I can close with one thing, it's how important it has been to have my research from Pacific studies and in the humanities. Niue stories, flourishing Niue futures, can only be realized with clear and strategic investment in spaces like the humanities, in departments like Taonga Niue, in education and research that centers Niue storytelling, history, identity, philosophy, arts and performance, ways of knowing and being, investment in us as people who are capable of telling our own stories in our own ways. Whakauelahi o te rou.